A conference such as this is a temporary gathering of a sector coming together of people who care deeply about the role and responsibility of higher education in society. For these days, we become a learning community. We come together to think, to question, to listen, to argue, to offer, to receive, to build, to heal, and to contribute to a growing body of knowledge around higher education community engagement. We come together not because any one of us has all the answers, but because together we may be able to ask better questions, sharpen our practice, deepen our scholarship, and strengthen the work we each carry in our own institutions and communities. And what a privilege it is to look around this room and recognize that we have with us many of the shining lights in the sector, some of the brightest minds, deepest practitioners, and the most committed champions to community engagement. In many ways, this gathering feels like a constellation. People whose work has illuminated different parts of the higher education landscape, now gathered together for a few days to think, to share, and to help us see further. This, for me, is one of the most beautiful aspects of a gathering like this. It's an act of generosity, and every presenter who stands up here to share their work is offering something of themselves. Every delegate who listens carefully is participating in the building of the field. And every question, every challenge, story, and reflection becomes part of a larger act of giving and receiving, of sharing. In this way, the conference nourishes the sector. It creates a space where community engagement practitioners, scholars, students, institutional leaders, and community partners can feed off each other's ideas, arguments, experiences, and struggles. We need spaces like this because the work of community engagement is demanding, it's relational, it's slow, complex, and deeply contextual. It asks us to work across boundaries between university and community, disciplines, theory and practice, knowledge and action, justice and care, hope and the hard realities of inequality. But it's precisely because the work is difficult that we need to gather. We need to remind one another that community engagement is not peripheral to higher education. It is not an add-on. It's not a charity. It's not outreach, and not simply a set of ways in which, not simply a set of projects that make universities look good. At its best, community engagement is one of the ways in which higher education discovers its public purpose. It is one of the ways in which universities become more human, more accountable, more responsive, and more deeply connected to the societies of which they are a part, and not a part. They are a part and not a part. Our theme this year asks us to think carefully about reparative futures and the cultivation of humanity. These are not small ideas. They ask difficult questions of us. What does it mean for higher education to be reparative in societies shaped by colonialism, apartheid, inequality, exclusion, epistemic justice, poverty, violence, and ecological precarity? What does it mean for universities to cultivate humanity, not only in students, but in ourselves, our institutional cultures, our curricula, our research practices, our partnerships, and our relationships with communities? And what does it mean to do community engagement in ways that do not reproduce paternalism, extraction, or unequal power, but instead build reciprocity, dignity, mutuality, justice, and care? These are the questions that bring us together. Over the next 3 days, we will hear from keynote speakers, scholars, practitioners, community partners, and students. We will engage with work that explores reparative universities, knowledge democracies, Ubuntu, community-based participatory research, service learning, student volunteering, engaged teaching and learning, social justice, local development, epistemic repair, and the many ways in which universities and communities are working together to build more humane futures. We will also celebrate the growing maturity of this field. The quality and number of abstracts received for this conference reflect a sector that is thinking deeply and creatively. Community engagement in higher education is developing its own scholarship, methodologies, ethical questions, evidence-based and conceptual language. And if community engagement is to take its rightful place as a core function of higher education, then we must continue to build the knowledge base that sustains it. We must write, we must publish, we must theorize from practice, we must document what we are learning, we must listen to communities as knowledge partners. We must create spaces where the knowledge produced in university community partnerships is valued, is shared, challenged, and extended. The conference is one such space, and I want to thank every person who's made this gathering possible. To our keynote speakers, our panelists, our presenters, and facilitators, thank you for your intellectual generosity and for trusting the space with your ideas. To our delegates, thank you for being here and for bringing your presence, your questions, and your experience. To our community partners, thank you for continuing to remind universities that knowledge lives in many places. And to the Rhodes University Community Engagement team, thank you for the extraordinary work, patience and care and persistence that have brought us this far and to this moment. So it's now my privilege to invite our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sizwe Mabizela, to formally open the conference. Professor Mabizela is an appropriate leader to lift and launch this gathering because his leadership speaks so directly to the themes before us. His 10 years Vice-Chancellor has been sharpened by a transformative commitment to the role of Rhodes University in society, and particularly to the responsibility of the university in relation to Makanda. His legacy is deeply connected to the idea that Rhodes University must not simply be located in the city, but must be meaningfully, ethically, and practically committed to it. That vision resonates profoundly with our conference theme, Reparative Futures for the Cultivation of Humanity, and it reminds us that leadership in higher education is not only about institutional excellence, but about courage, justice, rational accountability, and care. So, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, it's my honor to invite the Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes University, Professor Sizwe Mabizela, a most wonderful colleague, to formally open the 2026 International Community Engagement Conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sai, for those kind words. Chair and other members of the local conference organizing committee, our keynote speakers, conference participants, honored guests, colleagues, and friends. It is with great delight that I welcome you all to Rhodes University, to Makanda, to the Makanda municipality, to the Eastern Cape province, perhaps for some of you, a very warm welcome to the African continent. We extend an equally warm welcome to all those participants who are joining us virtually from across the globe. We convey our sincere appreciation and gratitude to the local organizing committee for their dedication and meticulous planning of this very important conference, which I'm confident will be intellectually enriching and thought-provoking. On behalf of our university and the conference organizing committee, we acknowledge with profound appreciation our distinguished keynote speakers who have very kindly and graciously accepted our invitation to address this conference. We further extend our heartfelt thanks to all conference presenters for their time and effort in preparing their presentations for this conference. We are equally indebted to those who will be presenting their posters. This conference would not have been possible without your participation and contribution. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge with deep gratitude our donor partners. They are named in the program, and they are the Standard Bank Tutua Community Foundation, Liberty Community Trust, Davies Foundation Trust, Kagiso Trust, Kavok Trust, Catch Trust, Makana Winds of Change Community Trust, Jim Joel Fund, and RU Masake Project. These donor funders are very important to the work that we do, and we are deeply grateful for their generosity and for their support. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, this conference held under the theme Higher Education Community Engagement, Reparative Futures for the Cultivation of Humanity provides an important space for critical reflection and robust engagement on how higher education institutions can possibly confront some of the harm they have, intentionally or inadvertently, help produce, and how they might reposition and reshape themselves in the process. While higher education is rightly regarded as a driver of intellectual advancement and social mobility, it is important to acknowledge its shortcomings and its own contradictions. Historically, and in contemporary contexts, higher education has at times been complicit in perpetuating various forms of harm, including exclusion, inequality, and systemic injustice. We in South Africa know this all too well, having gone through colonization and apartheid. Institutions of higher learning have often mirrored and reinforced broader societal disparities, whether through limited access along lines of race, class, and gender, entrenched inequalities in funding and resources, or curricula and knowledge systems that privilege and value certain perspectives while silencing others. These patterns have contributed to the reproduction rather than dismantling of social hierarchies. As such, higher education institutions carry a profound responsibility not only to acknowledge this legacy, but also to actively pursue transformative changes. This entails fostering inclusive environments, broadening access, interrogating dominant epistemologies, and ensuring that the production and dissemination of knowledge contribute meaningfully to equity, dignity, and social justice. This conference, therefore, challenges us to engage with honesty and courage in confronting both the historical and present shortcomings of our universities. Many among us are acutely aware of the all too familiar and persistent concern expressed by communities in which researchers and postgraduate students conduct their research. Too often, these communities experience research as an extractive process, one in which data is gathered, findings are published, and academic qualifications are obtained, yet, little tangible benefit accrues to those whose lives and contexts underpin that research. This critique calls for a fundamental rethinking of how research is conceptualized and conducted within higher education. It underscores the need to move towards more ethical, reciprocal, and community-centered approaches that recognize communities not merely as sites of data collection, but also equal partners in knowledge production. Such an approach demands that research outcomes are shared in accessible ways, that communities derive meaningful value from the work conducted, and that long-term relationships are cultivated to support sustainable development and mutual learning. This also calls for a modicum of humility and an acknowledgement that there is vast knowledge that resides in our communities which can enrich the academy. We should not approach our communities with this notion that we know what is good for them, that we are there to help them. We should be ever so humble and be open to a different way of learning and appreciate the vast knowledge that resides in our communities, work with that knowledge to ensure the emancipation of our communities. We are therefore called upon to interrogate how higher education institutions can more deliberately position community engagement at the core of their academic mission, particularly in ways that address historical injustices and contribute to the restoration of social justice and the cultivation of humanity. More specifically, we must explore how teaching, research, and community engagement can be meaningfully integrated to foster a more humane, equitable, and socially responsive academy, one that not only generates knowledge, but also contributes actively to societal healing, empowerment, and sustainable development. We must remain ever so vigilant and resist the purely instrumentalist framing of education shaped by neoliberalism, which positions universities primarily as mechanisms of producing employable graduates, driving economic growth, and supplying skills to serve the industry. While these functions are undoubtedly important and form a legitimate part of the higher education mandate, they should not be allowed to define or delimit its full purpose. What is required is a deliberate shift towards a more expansive, human-centered conception of higher education, one that foregrounds the cultivation of critical thought, ethical reasoning, social responsibility, human solidarity, and the development of the whole person. Such an approach recognizes universities not only as engines of economic participation, but also as vital spaces for nurturing democratic citizenship, advancing social justice, and contributing meaningfully to the public good. This is not an argument against employability, skills development, or economic contribution. Rather, it is a call to resist reducing higher education solely to these instrumental ends. A reparative, human-oriented university does not reject employability, economic contribution, or skills development. It, however, situates these within a broader vision of education as a public good. The challenge before us is to hold these two orientations, the instrumentalist on the one hand and the human-centered approach on the other, in productive tension. In doing so, we must ensure that the instrumental imperatives do not overshadow or subordinate the broader transformative role that higher education ought to play in a society. When universities assume the posture of ivory towers, detached, insular, and disconnected from the societies they serve, the public is justified in questioning their relevance and their legitimacy as institutions committed to the public good. In this regard, the allocation of significant institutional resources towards the pursuit of global rankings warrants critical scrutiny. Such pursuits do little to advance the deeper normative mission of higher education, namely the cultivation of humanity. As aptly observed by Chris Brink, rankings, I quote, compress reality into a ranked list in which higher up means better and lower down means worse. They encourage us to fall into line. When we do so, we acknowledge that the ranking, the list, the lineup is an order of esteem, end quote. Colleagues, higher education institutions are called upon to invest meaningfully in teaching, research, and community engagement initiatives that nurture critical citizenship, advance social justice, and respond to the lived realities of the communities they serve. In doing so, the true value of the university is realized not through its position in the global league tables, but through its contribution to the public good and the flourishing of humanity. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, once more, on behalf of our university, I bid you a very warm welcome to this conference. I sincerely hope that this conference will afford you space and time critically to reflect on the central role of community engagement in the mission of higher education and help restore public confidence in the enduring value and social purpose of higher education. I wish you stimulating, productive, fruitful, and successful deliberations. And may you, at the end of this important conference, leave Rhodes University with a renewed hope and optimism that through our individual and collective acts of care, compassion, and service, tomorrow will be a better day than today. I thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm a little tall, so I'm going to have to bend forward a bit. That is not a slight at Prof. Mabizela. That is a result of my parents. My name is Sakentla Bezo, and I think because of my youth, Dai has asked me, maybe not so kindly, to play a facilitating role throughout the entire conference for the various dialogues and keynotes that we'll be having. So we're going to swiftly segue into the very first one. Prior to that, I'd just like to introduce one of the technical components that we'll be using. Because we've got quite a limited amount of time, and we want to encourage as much conversation and input as possible, during or possibly slightly after each keynote or dialogue presentation, there'll be a QR code that's put up on the screen. We're going to encourage everyone to just please share your thoughts, your inputs, your perspectives, your provocations on that platform. Every single one will be processed either during the moment or throughout the conference itself, and it will help inform a very difficult job that Dr. Margie Maestri has to do, which is to consolidate the entire conference. And already, I think Margie's indicated there's about 4 papers that she's going to write on the basis of those things, and there's about 3 of you that she will handpick to write those papers. So please be prepared. And if you see Margie, please run. The very first of our many, many esteemed keynote presentations will be from Professor Andre Keat. Professor Andre is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation at Nelson Mandela University and currently holds the Research Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation. His research and postgraduate supervision focuses on radical approaches to the study of higher education, such as critical and abolitionist university studies. His work is relational and intergenerational, exploring the intersections of friendship, politics, love, and justice. These themes inform his praxis in higher education transformation, human rights, decentered critical university studies, and the relationship between universities, science, industry, and societies. Colleagues and friends, please give a very warm welcome to Professor Andre Keat.
No, that's not mine. That one there. Come on, brother. This one, yeah. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you, VC, for setting the scene so well, and Dai, of course, as always. Thanks so much for opening this event with the kind of expertise that you've built up over so many years. So friends, I was here last week. But I think there's less than 30% overlap between the two presentations there. So don't worry too much about that. And that was for the transformation in Durban. So many thanks once again then to Dai and the team, the VC, the DVCs, the Rhodes community, and all those attending from across our country, continent, and planet. And I've seen already some great colleagues here as well. I'm grateful for the invitation because it allows one to sharpen your thoughts, your practices, also your own self-reflexivity as well. And I want to acknowledge the work of the Rhodes University Community Engagement Outfit, RUSE, who has been, with no doubt, a leading actor in both the scholarship of engagement and the programmatic expression of the foundational shifts happening in engagement across the globe and our country. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of, at this significant event, of some of the most productive scholars and practitioners from our country and other parts of the globe, including those from my own institution, Nelson Mandela University. Di already referred to the shining lights, and I am certainly privileged to be in your space. I will start off with some ideas on the transformative responsive university, then reflect on its link with the conference theme, after which I will spend some time on critique and self-reflexivity, which you will see is one of the key capabilities in the Nussbaum idea, of course, the philosopher who popularized cultivating humanity. Of course, there were other scholars before her as well. Then, of course, I will switch into a brief discussion on techno-rationality, which will be followed by some thoughts on how community engagement can work against some of the troubling developments of our sector and of our times. I will conclude with some thoughts on engagement as more than a function of the university. It is a struggle over how the university is. When Mutwa and I started working on the conception of the transformative responsive university some time ago, we were trying to respond, as came through in the VC's remarks as well, to a conception of engagement as convergence. And there are many writings on that by now after 6 years. We're trying to give it flesh and also give it some philosophical and theoretical orientation. My colleagues at Mandela University will share a case study later on based on this conception at this conference. This particular university is one of the many imaginations of the university because there are so many framings of particular conceptions of the university across the globe. And it is here offered as an option for debate and contestation, not a truth. In the Mutwa and Keat piece, we argue that South African higher education has become imaginatively stunted in how we understand the interface between transformation and engagement. These concepts are routinely reduced to compliance, access, equity metrics, and benevolent outreach, leaving the character and orientation of the university itself fundamentally untouched. So we proposed an alternative, located deliberately at the interface of engagement and transformation, oriented towards plural conceptions of justice, because there are many, as the political expression of love. Our core claim is that authentic transformation and engagement are co-constitutive. They make each other and require a rupture with the dominant image of the university. And this is perhaps the deceptively straightforward contribution of this particular work. Shifts in engagement practices are not simply technical or programmatic. They are derived from authentic self-transformations within us and within our institutions, by which the transformative character of the university can take shape. This is the framework in which we try to work, and it seems also the framework here at Rhodes University, where engagement can activate shifts and free up the transformative capacities of the university and vice versa. There are other examples, of course, and just look at the abstracts within the book, shows that so many of you are already working at that particular interface. But this formulation is not new. It can be traced back to some of the policy work and briefings of the Council of Higher Education since the early 2000s. It simply got lost, and I don't know why. It's some of the work that we still have to do. Because South Africa literally had in its policy formulation the interface between engagement and transformation already in the 2000s. So despite the massive growth in scholarship on engagement and transformation in our context and elsewhere, this particular excavation of this interface has not happened in ways that we think it should. So in addition, Mutwa and Keat tracked the work on civic engagement and the civic responsibility of the university across various international contexts in this book of Brink, and engaged with a great edited compilation of work in Hall and Tandon's Socially Responsible Higher Education, International Perspectives on Knowledge Democracy. It was with the Brink's book, which was referred to by the VC as well, to an invitation from him to contribute a chapter which was published in 2021, which we then took a deeper dive into the conceptual and programmatic options available to us and settled for the transformative responsive university as a way of generating this particular critical interface between transformation and engagement. But we make a crucial distinction between transformational, which everybody think they can do, and transformative. Transformational approaches respond to changes in higher education systems by focusing on improving efficiencies, effectiveness, and competitiveness whilst reproducing the status quo. And that's the main way in which universities refer to the notion of transformational. Sometimes I think it gets conflated with the notion of transformative. Transformative approaches begin with justice, interrogate power, disrupt taken for granted assumptions, and aims at reconstituting the institutional purposes of our organizations, which is also something that came through to both the contributions from Dai and the Vice-Chancellor. South African universities, we argue at that time, of course, which is 2021, overwhelmingly pursue the former, meaning transformational, whilst rhetorically invoking the latter. So you will find social justice, equity, equality in all our strategic plans in the country. This particular distinction between transformational and transformative, with a few exceptions, is not honored in the literature. In fact, there are so many conceptual slippages between them, even in our scholarship, that creates a particular kind of ambiguity in our definitional framework with regard to social justice-oriented engagement. So you can pursue, and this is the argument later on, you can pursue efficiencies through techno-rationality and, of course, call that pursuit. You can call that social justice, which I think it's erroneous. But this also weakens our conceptual clarity apropos transformation practices in South Africa. And thus we prefer transformative above transformed to denote an orientation and not an endpoint. Okay, so you speak about not the transformed university, the transformative university. Similarly, we speak about the responsive university as an ongoing institutional movement. That's the argument around the transformative responsive university. I will bring these thoughts into conversation with techno-rationality later on, but for now, would like to reflect on the interplay between my choice of title for this address and the amazingly exciting theme of the conference, Higher Education Community Engagement, Reparative Futures for the Cultivation of Humanity. So apologies for traversing some of the areas of work that you are, obviously already well acquainted with. The notion of cultivating humanity as advanced by Nussbaum and those before her are dependent on three capacities: critical self-examination, that is self-reflexivity. Now imagine that one of your top political philosophers, of course, argued that self-reflexivity, critical self-examination is the key capacity. World citizenship and narrative imagination. That should be reread through South African realities of colonial and apartheid harm. That is, can abstract universalism cultivate humanity in contexts where humanity itself was systematically violated? This question, of course, is then moderated by Leslie Lagrange's Ubuntu as architectonic capability in relation to Nussbaum's capability theory that identifies 10 central capabilities: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, sense, imagination, thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. Leslie argues that Ubuntu, understood as humanness realized through relationality, community, and ethical obligation to both human and more than human others, goes beyond Nussbaum's central capability of affiliation by infusing all capabilities with an ethic of interdependence and dignity. Situated against the legacies of colonialism, apartheid capitalism, and ecological destruction in Southern Africa, Leslie contends that viewing Ubuntu as an architectonic capability foregrounds becoming, and not only being and doing, and offers a transformative lens through which societies can reimagine development, healing, and quality of life beyond narrow economic growth. Melanie Walker's work, which has been great and productive in the higher education space, especially around the question of capabilities, suggests a set of capabilities for higher education itself. Now, on the slide, you would note her focus on social relations and networks that ties up with Leslie's articulation on affiliation and Ubuntu to what I generally refer to as love and relationality. The second part of the conference theme that focuses on repair also invokes Melanie's work, built on the massive insights of Akhil Mbembe, argues that the public good of higher education should be understood as a project of repair rather than merely an economic contribution or individual advancement. She shows how, in sub-Saharan Africa, but explicitly global in relevance, colonialism and contemporary neoliberalism have produced deep disrepairs, epistemic, material, moral, and relational, that continue to shape universities and society. Walker proposes repair as a normative, forward-looking project aimed at undoing past injustices, preventing their reproduction, and fostering more just social futures. She argues for the human development and capabilities framework as the overarching architecture for this repair project, within which repair is framed as unfinished collective. I am working with colleagues at Stellenbosch University, and I see that Renee is not on the program. She says that she didn't get the emails die, so that's a bit of a pity. But I'm working with colleagues on a project on education as repair at the Stellenbosch University, and I was hoping that Renee would share more about this later on in the conference, but we'll see how we will be able to manage it in the session after this. The link between Walker's work, of course, and that work of cultivating humanity links up with the overall theme of the conference, but as well as its sub-themes, and I hope that I've sufficiently established these connections through these few paragraphs. That's values, ethics, Ubuntu, community engagement as core academic work, reparative universities and anchor institutions, scholarship of engagement, monitoring and evaluation, and curriculum decoloniality and epistemic justice. Now this shifts into critique and self-reflexivity, the first capacity of Nussbaum, and of course, so many of the capabilities in any list that you will find on higher education. My overall argument is that the transformative responsive university provides an imagination and conception of higher education that may respond well to the central questions that this conference is putting on the table. However, the impact of such a response will be dependent on a critical ontology of the academy itself, a critical ontology of us as practitioners, and a critical ontology of the university as institution, since the transformative of the institution is deeply connected to the transformative and responsiveness of the self. Yet the argument that we within universities seldom have an accurate and honest understanding of ourselves is not only supported by studies, but we also experience it in our daily organizational lives. Who do we really think we are, as a question is seldom responded to with rigorous self-reflexivity. Thus, we produce weak categories of self-understanding because we do not have access to our own assumptions. Neither do we have access to the practical consequences of these assumptions for theory, practice, and academic life. And this is where the task of disclosing critique announces itself. Writing the university as a critical ontology requires a form of critique that avoids both moral denunciation and managerial optimism. The university is not a neutral institution awaiting better leadership, but it is a historically constituted formation whose contradictions are structural rather than accidental. Critique fails when these tensions are treated as ethical shortcomings or individual weaknesses instead of effects of governance through metrics, rankings, and technocratic rationality. This form of critique is an inquiry into how institutional rationalities, modes of thinking, norms, and subjects are produced over time. Drawing on Foucauldian insight, it shows how actors come to recognize themselves in governing logics that render compliance reasonable and contestations administrable. Rather than personalizing blame, critical ontology foregrounds how institutional rationalities absorb critique and make injustice functional through procedures that appear progressive. Yet this critique also holds open the possibility that the university, despite its deep constraints, remains one of the most powerful sites of emancipation, where alternative ways of organizing academic life and community engagement can still be imagined and enacted. And I think this is precisely how this conference is framed. As I argued last week, the mode of disclosing critique, it is not an accusation, but a revelation to show, to unmask, to uncover. It names the gap between institutional self-image and institutional practice, between what I say or think I am doing and what I am actually doing. This is not to condemn actors as wicked, but to make visible the structural and discursive schemata and mechanisms through which the self shields itself from interrogative self-reflexivity. Once we grasp the work on the self, it may become clearer that the transformative response of university is not only meant to track change, it actively remakes itself through ethical, critical, reflexive knowledge practices that reshape its purposes, relationships, and forms of life in a continuous forward movement. Now let me shift to the question of techno-rationality. There are a number of truth packages and dominant frames that circulates within global higher education. And our uncritical adoption of themselves is one of our key challenges within the academy. Apart from the work on the purposes and key mandates of the universities, we have the truth package of excellence. We have truth packages of institutional sustainability that trump almost everything else. We have the truth packages of the sustainable development goal that hoodwink us that we will be able to save the planet. We have truth packages around transformation, diversity, and equity. We have truth packages around public and social legitimacy, human rights decolonization, and then, of course, now techno-rationality. There may be more, I'm sure. As part of our work on disclosing critique in our research chair, we have shown how the South African higher education system remains structurally and discursively racialized through a dominant discourse of excellence that reproduces historical hierarchies of institutional worth. It dictates what universities are good and what universities are bad. We argue that excellence operates as an ideological and managerial technology that justifies inequality, hierarchies, and it disciplines institutional behavior and forecloses solidaristic alternatives, resulting in a system-level racialization of the university sector. That's why it's so difficult for universities to create solidaristic relationships and speak in one voice when they need to. In another project, we tried to disclose that racism does not merely infiltrate knowledge. Racism owns knowledge. Knowledge belongs to racism. Within the context of racial capitalism and the racial ordering of the world, racism's knowledge suggests a radical proposition that formalized disciplinary knowledge itself belongs to racism, interpolating us all, the scholar, the practitioner, the activist, into its gravitational field. Grounded in Black studies, indigenous epistemologies, and feminist praxis, racism's knowledge as a proposition, as a battle, as a challenge, attempts at charting radical pathways towards refuel, reparation, and revolutionary solidarity. You know, like to free yourself just temporarily from its hold so that you can offer transformative visions for planetary justice and the renewal of higher education's ethical horizon. One of our recent projects explore necrocapitalism's earthly wounds, planetary sustainability, racism, and the university, arguing that the planetary crisis stems from the ecological consequences of racism and colonialism. Climate change reflects the accumulated damage caused by racial capitalism and violence, which determines whose lands and bodies could be sacrificed. Addressing the crisis requires acknowledging how race shapes destruction and how universal narratives conceal violence, perpetuate collapse, and imagine futures at the cost of those already living its end. Nowhere is this more evident than in Gaza and in the power, religious, and petroleum wars that we are seeing nowadays. Knowledge is an epistemes that kills. In essence, and in line with Mbembe's work on the earthly community, the planetary crisis can only be engaged with in tandem with the discriminatory orders that produced it. And this includes racism, sexism, the displacement and annihilation of indigenous and traditional life worlds, and so on. Within this, the university produces the expertise that enables extraction, legitimate and popularize growth-oriented sustainability frameworks like the SDGs, and police what counts as valid planetary knowledges, often marginalizing those who actually know what it means, like indigenous communities. Necroplanetary describes how the Earth itself is governed through necropolitical and racial capitalist logics, where some lives, lands, and futures are protected while others are rendered expendable in the management of the planetary crisis. We see this in our country, our continent, our province. Another project highlights how universities increasingly adopt global discourses such as human rights and decolonization and the SDGs in ways that limit their critical and transformative potential. Human rights frameworks tend to go unquestioned. Decolonization is often reduced to bureaucratic slogans. And the SDG, importantly, reinforces neoliberal assumptions of growth and market rationality, contributing to the ecological collapse it is meant to challenge. Our argument is that once the SDG framework successfully summoned the global institutions of money and power into its orbit, universities came to read their own sustainability and survival as dependent on uncritical alignments with the SDGs. So a vast global system then emerged, comprising rankings, guidebooks, platforms, research pipelines, and of course the steering mechanism of funding instruments that circulates now around the SDGs, newspapers dedicated to it. What presents itself then as a planetary ethic thus operates as a prescriptive governance regime, narrowing the university's critical horizon. A university is not supposed to adopt a normative framework uncritically. That's the task of the university. As with human rights and decolonization at the institutional apex, the SDG discourse became self-referential, so it pitched itself at a level that makes critique almost impossible. Okay? And that is the way in which we got hoodwinked into it as a normative frame. And the problem is not the SDGs and the challenges that it's trying to address. The problem is the university's uncritical treatment of the SDGs that creates the challenges. And that's why the SDGs are now adopted as annexures to our strategic plans. Quite a weird thing for universities to do, eh? To be called a university, of course. These examples of disclosing critiques of the university are generated, of course, by an entire team and researchers in our space whom I herewith acknowledge. I'm thankful, and some of them are here at the conference. A disclosing critique acknowledges that we are produced through discourse, we ourselves as we sit here, regulated through power, worked on through everyday practices such as discipline, assessment, and self-surveillance. And such critique is generative, not merely polemical or forensic. I'm not trying to be polemical at all. That is, actors in the university are seen as neither heroes nor villains. They are subjects formed by history and configured within and by the very apparatuses they are trying to transform. Yet despite these powerful structuring processes, the self within the university and the university as an institution remains one of the most powerful sites of possible freedom. And it is in disclosing critique where we can unburden the constraints that should take us there. Because it is disclosing critique that will open up the spaces for action where we are freed from ourselves, so to speak. So the self's work on itself in questioning its own truth packages and practices is at one and the same time act of institutional critique and renewal. In this way, self and institutional critique are not simply theoretical, they are profoundly practical interventions. How else, if you just think of engagement over the past 10 to 15 years, how else would an engagement of 10 years ago then be able to define the gaps, the opening by which a new engagement, which this conference so boldly advanced, is to take shape? The work is already being done. And this is where we draw our energy and optimism from as a collective, just perhaps to reframe the VC's point that he made. But I want to have this particular tension between an energetic optimism, which is real, and of course the constraints which are also real, this particular tension, so that our reflections are not fluffy, looking at the ceiling type of reflections, but reflections that literally unsettle the self, by which the university can also be disrupted. Techno-rationality is the latest dogmatic affliction within the university VC, for which we require a disclosing critique. By the time that we opened our eyes, a form of thinking was already so dominant in the university that it was difficult to challenge it. In my estimation, there are three forms of thinking in the university, in the global contemporary university, that are very, very dominant. It's SDGism, because it's an ideology. Then resilience and institutional sustainability, and then technocratic rationality. So this conference asks a deceptively simple question: how can higher education community engagement promote the cultivation of humanity? But to answer it honestly in 2026, through a disclosing critique, we must first confront a more uncomfortable reality, that universities themselves are increasingly governed by logics that struggle to recognize humanity at all. And techno-rationality is one of those forms. Universities are perpetually being framed as being in a crisis. You know how many books are there about the university at the crossroads, and how many articles? And I'm talking about like more than 200, 300 years ago. This university has forever been in a crisis. It seems like the university is obsessed with being in a crisis, according to the observers. Once we get out of a crisis, we're back into a crisis. But in the new crisis, the university is put at that crossroads so that it legitimizes techno-rationality, like a hegemonic sociologic that elevates technological reasoning as primary modes of responding to complexity. You can see it all over in the university. The university is complexifying, so instead of thinking of uncertainty types of leadership, no, we want apps and systems and dashboards to fix those particular kinds of complexities for us. In this mode of thinking, to argue against technology appears irrational, and critique is very difficult to hear. And so you have quicker decisions on how to invest in technology, and you have more difficult decisions on how to invest in transformative engagement in the university. I can promise you, if you do a test within those budget meetings, community engagement will lose. And what should concern us here, of course, is not the problem of technology, but the way in which techno-scientific ideology has hailed higher education into a culture that seeks its authorization in technology, finds its satisfaction in technology, and takes its orders from technology. Okay, and I'm quoting Postman, almost 30 years ago. So techno-rationality is not simply the use of technology, but a broader social logic that dominates management, learning and teaching, and research thinking in higher education. Now, of course, the colleagues in learning and teaching will know that there's massive, massive challenges awaiting them as this particular digital technologies are unfolding. Now, this links up with Mbembe's idea of the hyper-technological and framing of the live world, which helps us see that technology is no longer merely a tool, but technology is a structuring environment, that reconfigures even the way in which the mind works and shapes how problems are named and how futures are imagined, including our engagement futures. For those of you who are following these court cases across the globe, will see the number of them from the Scandinavian countries, and I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, also 2 or 3 states in the US, where the social media platforms, driven by different forms of AI, has lost, massive, massive cases in this regard. So there's an awakening about the way in which the reframing of the mind and, of course, the structuring impulses of technology is having severe, severe negative implications for the university project. Within the emerging condition as described as technoscience society, technoscientific systems and rationalities no longer simply support social life, they actually configure it. Right? You can see it in your households every day. They are not simply supporting social life, they are actively reconfiguring it. The point, however, is not to reject technology. The problem is not technology in itself, but the uncritical rise of techno-solutionism and techno-rationality as dominant modes of reasoning within the university. Technology seems to be in search of a problem. The task is therefore to hold open the emancipatory possibilities of technology, because it has emancipatory value, whilst refusing its ideological elevation into an unquestioned truth. Research on our own research, across 6,800 articles, shows that higher education is not productively bringing digital transformation and social justice transformation together. Instead, they often appear as separate domains of thoughts and practice. So when scholars say, no, we are using technology to tackle social inequalities, don't believe it, because the research that they do doesn't show and support that particular kind of claim. Because what the research is showing is that the technological turn is increasingly detached from questions of justice, curriculum, language, and other forms of human-centered transformations within the university. This is so because digital technology has already entered the university without being shaped in advance by questions of justice, and so it will likely deepen existing inequalities and generate new ones. The university that celebrates innovation, and there are many of them, while leaving its knowledge hierarchies, exclusion, and historical inheritance intact, will simply digitize old injustices. Not only will the university digitize its own inequalities, it will further convert engagement into forms of computational and calculatable analyses. For instance, there is a massive growth in learning and teaching technology and student engagement research in learning and teaching, and there are already work on how technology will make community engagement in higher education more relevant. So technology, here again, has been seen, we see in terms of the questions that you raised for engagement, as one of the possible solutions to the challenges that this conference may be facing. But this conference rationale explicitly frames Ubuntu, universal human values, reparative engagement, and the cultivation of humanity as central to the future of that particular engagement. So it has to deal with the question of techno-rationality, of course, because the most dangerous idea in higher education today may well be the lulling assumption, this assumption that makes you not think, the lulling assumption that technological modernization is equivalent to progress. It is not. These court cases are showing it. So the framing here is important because Ubuntu should be regarded then as more than a moral supplement to university work. It offers a counter logic to techno-rationality itself. Oh, I have to rush now, my gosh. Okay. So I'm not going to go through the way in which Ubuntu, maybe I just say, like, for instance, where techno-rationality atomizes, Ubuntu insists on a relational person would say that there's an entire philosophical difference between these two. But of course, Ubuntu should not be romanticized, and Ubuntu should also remain open to critique. Community engagement against techno-rationality. And it is here that the idea of the transformative responsive university becomes a possible option. I'm not saying the option, as an alternative institutional orientation capable of engaging the question of techno-science society, critically because it imagines the university at the interface of transformation and engagement. And this interface is the place of critique and renewal of our institutions, our own histories, our assumptions, our cultural practices, even the transformation of our self-images, our relationship with communities, and so on. And it is here that we may engage with technologies not as primarily a technical task, but as an ontological and institutional struggle over what kind of university, knowledge, and futures are being made. So my biggest worry is that at the very moment where this entire group is turning engagement upside down, inside out, and at the moment where we exchange charity and service for repair, is also the moment where we have to be so careful that techno-rationality is not driving us in a different direction. Because techno-rationality is built on an extractive technocratic ontology and ways of being, which may scuttle what I will call the new engagement movement in global higher education. So this, in simple terms, we have to remain vigilant and continuously deconstruct ourselves and our work to keep on activating the new directions for engagement that this conference has been working at and that you as practitioners has been engaged with. Community and engagement separately and combined may be the best place where this form of rationality is challenged in ways to advance better the ideal of cultivating humanity and reparative responsibility. As I now move towards conclusion, the question before us is not whether universities will be transformed by engagement in technology, but what kinds of universities, cells, and worlds that transformation will quietly, incrementally bring into being. What kinds of worlds are being produced whilst we're busy with this particular kind of engagement? If we take this idea seriously of this interface, then we are faced with one of our, I sound very dramatic today, with one of our most deadliest emergencies, no? And that is that through techno-rationality and techno-solutionism, we may become super efficient at reproducing an unjust and uninhabitable world. Now, the growth of inequalities on the back of digital technologies is already an indication that that may be happening. So our work, colleagues, are cut out. Community engagement, then framed as reparative responsibility and the cultivation of humanity, refuses this particular development, this particular ethic, and insists that the hardest work the university must do is on itself and through its relations with others. In a direct challenge to techno-rationality, repair can then emerge as a material, epistemic, and affective project that requires institutions to reorder what they value. Ubuntu suggests then that there can be no worthwhile human development, no cultivation of humanity that is not simultaneously a recultivation of our webs of dependence with humans and more than human others. For the transformative responsive university, disclosing critique is not an optional intellectual exercise. It is the institutional form of conscience. It is the practice that keeps open the gap between who we say we are and what we actually do. Through one key question: what kind of subject am I allowing myself to become in and through the university? Community engagement, understood as reparative, is a great space in the contemporary university where techno-rationality and all our other dominant truth packages can be challenged. It is the messy, contingent, often uncomfortable relations between universities and communities where these truth packages can be put on the table for critical interrogation, where, of course, both communities and universities are in a mutual process of transformation, which was also a case made by the VC earlier. This is my last slide. So here now, engagement, at least for me in reading it, as an ontological resistance in which its work is not simply understood as programs or a function or a set of activities in a university, but as a struggle over what kinds of human beings, what kinds of relationships and worlds the university helps to make possible. Thus, engagement is more than a function of the university. It is a struggle over how the university is. This conference, no doubt, leans towards the growth of the transformative responsive university, where engagement in an array of readings that I have found within this particular space is set free to remake our institutional purpose, to remake our epistemic hierarchies, and to remake our everyday habits. At its heart, this event is an act or a constellation, as Dai said earlier, of hope, an affirmation that the university can be remade in response to the futures calling us forward. The work curated by this conference reassures us that the tools for meaningful change are already alive among us. I wish you all the best with your deliberations. Many thanks.
Professor Andre, I'm going to ask you just to join me up here for a few minutes. And then I'm going to ask the technical crew if they're here. Is there a roaming microphone? It's coming around. All right, I'm going to take some liberties. I'll ask someone to just come help me put up the QR code. And we've got enough time to take 2 or 3 initial questions from the floor. Again, as a kind reminder, there will be a platform to share your thoughts, your responses, your provocations. I've been given no boundaries in terms of what can be shared. The only boundary was that people are encouraged to be honest. So please engage honestly and critically. And I must just say, as a personal reflection, the power of a good keynote is when it makes you surface and confront your own hidden thinking without realizing it. So thank you very much, Prof. All right, can we please take 2 or 3 questions from the floor? Anyone who would want to go first, please raise your hand. I see one hand over there. Are there any other hands? There's a second hand there. And then the last hand, going once, going twice. Sold to the crispy Tuesday. Third hand over there. Perfect. We've got our three hands. The first hand is Professor George Openjuru over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name has been mentioned, George Openjuru from Ngulu University. I would like to start by appreciating the deep presentation and analysis that was given by the professor on community university, Professor Kate, community university engagement. It's quite provocative. I was particularly provoked when he kind of raised an observation that there is a problem with universities.
My apologies, Prof. Can I just ask you to stand up because the cameras are struggling to catch you?
Thank you. When he raised the point that universities are always in crisis as a problem. And I thought universities must always be in crisis because they are spaces for contestations, for both forward and backward movement on account of its reflexive nature. It's a space where we make progress and evaluate progress, withdraw from what we thought was progress, and chart new direction. So I call it as a space for consolidating practice, resisting some practice, and even rebellion, and not a space of stable compliance. That is what I thought should be So I have no problem with universities always being at a crossroads, because they must constantly take decisions on which route to move society. I like the idea when he talked of techno-rationality. I bring in the idea of techno-colonialism, which is taking us back to what we call techno-feudalism. And it is something that we must pay attention to, because unconsciously, we are all becoming tenants of cloud loads through subscriptions. And at the same time, we are still grappling with landlords whose practice started during the feudal times. So I think as universities, as he has talked about, must continue to engage, and we see how we can take control of this technological progress, which apparently is taking place outside university space. So we need to come in and disengage with them to ensure that we don't move society in a direction of another control.
Prof,
From
I'm
which we
going
may
to
not-
humbly ask you to wrap your question, Prof.
Yes. So my question is the first one. The second one is an observation which I think is another crisis which the university needs to continue engaging in. And in doing community university practice, we should not inadvertently end up as recruiters into this technological control. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Andre, are you happy for me to take the next two? And then you'll consolidate. All right. This is second hand. It's over there, Dr. Damons.
Thank you, Chairperson. The first one is to the Vice-Chancellor. In his input, he spoke of the notion of us be careful that we shouldn't be towing the line. And I want to know, what does that mean for South African universities, given the political and social experiences that we have having now? Because historically, universities have been very strong and articulate in resisting oppressive systems. And to some extent, when we look at the political discourse and social discourse, we might suggest that we're finding ourselves in form of political oppression and discomfort. And universities have been very silent in articulating their political and historical role. So does towing the line only mean to the broader macro, or do we look at some of the micro oppressions or systemic ideas? The second one is to my boss. I promised him I'll ask a question that would critique him as well. So the question, Prof. Kiet, is a provocation one of our community members made to the university, Mandela University, when she said that universities have lost common sense, the use of common sense, and they cloak all their articulation in wonderful, mystical type of articulation. Is it true that we have lost common sense with all the beautiful knowledge that we have?
Thank you very much. And then the final input, I believe it was the gentleman with the cap. I can't quite see your face.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. Mine is not a question, but rather just a comment with regards to your presentation, because it really provoked thoughts, and you actually touched base on things that keeps on roaming in my mind every time I think about community engagement in the universities and the communities. So you actually touched base on one important aspect that I grasp about the universities as a public platform that can play a very transformative role in shaping South African economic trajectory by using community engagement as a pathway to address societal challenges that promote inclusive development and strengthen partnership between academia and communities. So with us being here today, I do believe that there are a lot of presentations that will be shared, and also experts are here that we collaborate and shape this country towards the right direction with community engagement and solve societal problems. So thank you very much for your informative presentation.
All right. Thank you very much. It was more of a comment and then a response, I guess, to your presentation. So we've got 2 questions, 2 from Prof. Njulu and 1 from Dr. Damons to you, Prof. Keat. Dr. Damons took the liberty of directing one to Professor Mabizela. So before we give you the chance to talk, I'm going to invite the VC if he'd like to share just a quick word or 2 in response. But again, it's a bigger question outside of the scope. Prof?
Thank you very much. My view is that higher education institutions should position themselves above the now and the pressures, particularly political pressures, that are imposed on them. They must address and respond to both micro and macro challenges that afflict the society. But I think it is also critically important that institutions of higher learning remain independent in their way of an engagement, and that they don't shy away from confronting power when such a need arises. And more importantly, institutions of higher learning should model the best that a society can be. And that in terms of even our own day-to-day engagement in institutions of higher learning, we should model the best that the society can be. And we have a responsibility, as I indicated, to use the unique privilege we have of molding and forming young people into the citizens that can make a positive contribution for the betterment of humanity, so that we can witness the emergence of a more just, a more humane, a more caring, a more inclusive society. It's something that we all can do. So we shouldn't shy away from confronting challenges. But I also mentioned the issue of solidarity, which is unfortunately in short supply. When we have an opportunity of shaping the future of young people and of ourselves, we should see the interconnectedness of all of us as part, not only of human race, but more fundamentally in recognizing that my own humanity can only reach its fullness if I recognize, affirm, and advance the humanity of others. Recognizing that what happens elsewhere in the world, be it in Gaza, Iran, or wherever, that also impacts me as an individual, as part of solidarity and as part of the human family. We should be able to identify with such. Sorry for that long answer, but these things are really important.
Thank you, Professor Mabizela. And then Professor Andre, over to you, sir.
Professor Andre. I like that pronunciation nogal. Prof. George, our university actually has some relationships with Gulu, so you probably connected there with Bruce as well. Ne? And then Catherine Odoro Hoppers is a good friend of mine. Who's now a research chair there in Canada somewhere. Now, George, of course, what can I say? I really liked your input. It was great, and I will certainly take these kinds of framings with me. So I just agree with what you've put on the table. And many thanks for its reframing in such a wonderfully productive way. So much thanks for that, of course. And the alert that you put on the table vis-a-vis university engagement practitioners not becoming recruiters, and that's of course for the house, right? And that's precisely what the presentation was trying to do, and that's what I don't know for how many years now, that is what I pursue as a disclosing critique, and it's the same with Bruce as well, to disclose, how universities are perhaps producing forms of articulations for particular interests that doesn't serve anybody else but themselves. So, and many of those, of course, it's true within the university space. Of course, Bordeaux's massive study on the professoriate in France so many years ago has already put that on the table. But Bruce gave me an option to actually share one of my thoughts that I shared last week. The one is that it also depends on what university, because within a university, there are many different types of university. Many types of different universities. You have the conventional universities, the universities that needs to be held together by different forms of conventional practices, and they are important. You have the decolonial university, you have the engaged university, you have the radical university, you have all kinds of universities operating within a university, which ties in with the ontology of contestations that George is speaking about. So if you have a university, say one space as a contested space, the idea that there will be sub-universities in that space is a fairly obvious one. And you can see it in the way that in which our colleagues organize. We organize in different communities, around different languages, around different interfaces with one another, and so forth and so forth. And I think that's actually the idea of the university, trying to reach a consensus and a one-story narrative about a university. I think it's the wrong way to go. And part of one of those universities, of course, may have lost common sense, Bruce. But the formulation of an engagement philosophy that is underpinning this conference, for instance, will say to me that the practitioners are certainly working against that. So that is just a way of sharing, this idea that I have about multiple universities within a university, and then of course that a community member who may experience one part of that university as losing its common sense is fairly accurate, I suspect, as well. And then the question of the common platform, from the last speaker is also highly, highly appreciated. So many thanks, colleagues, and many thanks for the opportunity provided to me. Okay, I highly appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor, and everyone for the initial comments. A kind reminder that QR code will remain up there for the next 20 or 30 minutes. Just again, if there are any additional responses, questions, provocations, curiosities, insert nice word here, please feel free to add them to that platform. We're hoping that it becomes a space to get some really useful information and insights. We are 10 minutes behind schedule, which is remarkable. For those that attend conferences within the first 2 hours, you're often an hour behind schedule. So we're doing great so far. I am going to take one slight liberty. We're going to break for tea now until 11:05, and not 11 as the program suggests. We have to run the next session and end it as promptly as possible at 12 because I believe one or two of our panelists has to jet off to the airport. So we're just going to cut tea by 5 minutes. I'm going to kindly ask everyone to be back in the room by 11:05. And before we break, I believe that there's some colleagues who are part of the posters presentation who have some questions about where they must go. There will be 2 people at the back who will be waiting to receive your posters. All right, colleagues, thank you very much. See you at 11:05.